Hi, Caroline. Hi, Bryn. How are you folks doing today? Oh, 1 second. I can't hear you.
Yes.
Ah, no, I can. Okay, it's not me.
No, sorry. Um, every time I connect to Zoom, I need to do a dance, basically. So,
Well, it's not like we're only using one tool, right? I think I switch between Teams, Google Meet, Slack, and Zoom multiple times a day.
oh no.
I feel fortunate that it's just Slack and Zoom over here.
At least. Be glad. Okay, so who has signed up? Benji's joining. That's good. Then Trask. Michael is out today. Valentine. Okay. So, in the people. Hi, Trask.
Hey, folks. Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you too. Glad someone with open telemetry experience is also on the call.
It's awesome to have uh, folks with GraphQL experience. We've definitely had people attempt to do semantic conventions in OpenTelemetry for GraphQL, and also in the both at the semantic convention layer and also in Java and other languages. And it's hard to tie both knowledge sets together.
Yeah, I'm really looking forward to it. There were a few attempts, and I believe, I don't know, Brendan, Caroline, you're both from Apollo, right? Are you both working on the telemetry integration on their side, or?
Yeah, I've done quite a lot of OTel, particularly with the Rust libraries, which has been challenging over the over the past couple of years because things are in flux. And yeah, you know, it's it like it's not the thing that sells our products, but it's certainly the thing that people need when they get when they're trying to get into production. So yeah, I'd be really keen on getting something getting to a situation where a user can connect to Datadog and for it to all just work. That would be the ideal, because it's not that experience at the moment.
Yeah, I completely agree. I completely agree. We also did our own specification more or less for it, so it would be fantastic if we would have just one instead of many. And I also hope that this is not just another, but we're pretty good in the foundation with this, that once we have a standard, most of the implementation will honor the standard because GraphQL is basically built on top of this methodology. But yeah, let's just not hope that we have 5 standards and afterwards we have 6. Okay, so let's give them another minute. Otherwise, we'll just start.
And for me, I'm pretty new to Apollo, so mostly here to like listen and learn and hopefully take some of the telemetry out of knowledge out of Bryn's head and share it around the team a little bit more. So that's why I'm here.
Sounds good. That sounds good. Okay, so then let's start. I'm really happy that this meeting is happening and all of you folks joined. We are still missing a few people. Maybe they join, maybe they don't. I know for a fact that Valentine probably is on the team retreat of Apollo. Benji just wrote me, oh crap, so he will probably join as well. And Michael is out today, so that makes us probably complete. First off, let me remind you that this meeting is recorded, and there's also an AI agent which will take notes. They are surprisingly good that we found with the other work groups we do. And please also keep in mind that by being here and being part of this call, you agree to the membership agreement, the participation guidelines, contribution guidelines, code of conduct, and all of the GraphQL specific documents there. They are all, I know, I mean, we know, Benji and I, we are on multiple work groups, so we've probably read them once or twice, but it's all same stuff. So just be kind to people and so on and so forth. Okay, what we usually do in these work groups is that we start with a round of introduction. And as this is the first meeting, maybe also a bit your motivation of being here and also the goals that you want to do or you want to achieve with this work group. So I'll start. I'm Pascal. I work for Chili Cream, and we are an open source company, and we've built graphical server, graphical client, all of the .NET stack, and also have a graphical gateway, and also have some telemetry tooling around. And as we own in the .NET side the whole stack, we also use OpenTelemetry, and we have an OTel collector where we ingest the data. And we now have dashboards which are specific for GraphQL. And we use standard OpenTelemetry tags and attributes and meters and all the fancy stuff that is provided from OpenTelemetry there. Now, we have, as we own the server, we can also define our, we can also make it work with our tooling, but it would be fantastic if, like if you use GraphIL or if you use Apollo or some other service server, that we all use the same spans and the same tags and the same meters so that we can just plug and play between the different toolings. So you can use Datadog, you can use Apollo, you can use Nitro, you can do whatever you want, and everything just works. And that's my goal a bit of this this work group, that we find a common ground and we actually get the specification into the semantics convention repository. That would be fantastic. So let's go in the order of attendees in the agenda, because that's just the easiest way to avoid chaos. Let me share this quickly so that you can actually, there you go. Oh, now Zoom is gone. Great. Do you see my screen?
I do. I'm next on the list. So hello, everyone. My name is Benji. Like Pascal, I'm one of the members of the GraphQL Technical Steering Committee, and I care about all the things that Pascal just said. But I think that one of my main roles here is to try and make sure that we don't shoot ourselves in the foot by going too far. So, for example, if we were to add tracing for every resolver call, we would be in a bad situation. So I want to make sure that we do things that are sensible. I do want it to be useful for all of the ecosystem, just as Pascal says. I think one of the key things about GraphQL in general is that there is a specification, which means we can build this shared tooling. And so we should make GraphQL better for everyone.
Ooh, I'm Trask, and I'm a semantic OpenTelemetry contributor, semantic convention maintainer, and Java maintainer. And I was excited to see that y'all were spinning up this group. This is the model that we would love to see going forwards. Obviously, open telemetry community can't do all libraries in the universe out there. And so we want libraries and, I mean, in your case, specifications to be empowered to do that work themselves. At the same time, we know that we're not there yet. Like there are some challenges. We're still new. A lot of things are still in flux. And so I wanted to come here to try to help you all be successful and maybe a model for future efforts.
Awesome. Very cool. So Michael is not here, and Valentine is also not here. So Bryn, you're next.
Hi, yeah. Pardon me, I've got a cough at the moment. So I'm a developer in Apollo, working on our GraphQL Rust-based federated server. And we've had quite a lot of experience now where our product is connecting to third-party APMs, because that's what users demand. And because of the lack of semantic conventions around GraphQL, that's actually very difficult for them to get started, because they don't have built-in dashboards that show useful information. You know, the existing conventions recommend sending, I believe, the GraphQL document, which is rather heavy, over the wire by default, and that's immediately a pain point for people. So yeah, what I'd like to see is a set of conventions that basically allow people to get going with any APM quickly, because they don't have to configure anything.
Cool. Caroline.
Hi, I'm Caroline. I'm also a developer at Apollo on the same team as Bryn. I don't have a lot to add to what he said. Honestly, I'm pretty new to both GraphQL and OTel and pretty much everything. So here to learn a lot and yeah, hopefully have something to contribute as well.
Cool. Awesome. Again, I'm very happy that you all joined, and I'm looking forward to collaborate with all of you on this. So the next step of the agenda is to determine volunteers for note-taking. That usually is a long discussion where everyone wants to take notes. I'm just kidding. Usually no one really wants to take notes. If you have any volunteers which want to take notes, then you can say this now. What I will do is as we discuss, I will write down a few things, and then we can add them to the repository regarding the next steps, and then you can also contribute to the pull request if you have anything to add. We also have the AI agent, as I said in the beginning, which will take notes for us. That's super handy. So yeah. Then the next step would be to review the agenda. And I mean, what we will do today, I think, but makes sense, is to quickly go to what is out there already in terms of OpenTelemetry and GraphQL. And then the next thing would be to identify what we actually want to. So before we define spans and attributes and meters and all of the OTel specific stuff, to actually think a bit about what do we actually want to achieve, like what's the insight that we want to give to users, and then we can have a quick discussion about how we get to the goal. Is there anything that people in the call would like to add to this agenda? Because then we can add this now. Cool. Okay, so currently, when you search for GraphQL OpenTelemetry, you actually see that there are semantic conventions, but they are rather sad because the only thing that we trace by conventions at the moment is the graphical operation type, which tells you if it's a query mutation or a subscription, the operation name, and the document. And as you have already pointed out, Bryn, sending the document for every operation that runs is definitely not something which is reasonable to do, because these documents can get rather large. And if all of the traces would contain this document, it would just be a waste of bandwidth and storage. So that's something that we have to we have to improve, I believe, when we define the new attributes for it. Then there is a few issues on the, I have opened them somewhere, on the semantics convention repository, and also a pull request where we've specified a bit what there could be in terms of traces. And just at the moment, this only specifies the trace. I think in the end, what we'd really like to have is also meters and maybe even attributes for logs. But I think these two things are quite crucial for GraphQL, that we define a generic trace format that a trace format that every GraphQL server uses, and also some meters and some counters that we can use there. Okay, so that's what's out there. And I don't think there is much more. There is a few pull requests, a few issues where we talked about that this should be specified, but it never was. And now, what I think we should do is we should talk a bit about what we actually want to achieve. So let me share the other screen. I think what would make sense is something on the lines of this. I have to move zoom to the other screen again. There you go. Okay. So what I wrote down here is just a few things which I came up with, what we actually want to provide to, actually, let me share the whole screen, what we want to provide to our customers. And we in Chili Cream, we have our tool here, which is called Nitro, where we have GraphQL telemetry that we provide to the user. For example, you can see your operations here, you can see how they perform, and you can also see a bit, you also have the insights into what traces there are, how this distributed, how this is executed, distributed, and so on. And based on our experience here, I've wrote down just a few things what we actually would like to provide as insights to the users. And I believe, let me make this a bit bigger. I believe that's probably a good starting point. So just to go through it quickly, a question that we try to answer with our tooling is, how does an operation or a resolver perform over time? So that you see a latency graph that your operation actually is improved or is slow or whatever. So the insight that you want to get is about the performance. Then something which is also quite interesting is to see which operations have errors, and actually we can also say which operations and fields resolvers have errors, so that you know that if something went wrong, you actually know where it went wrong. That's the beauty of GraphQL when you write a query, right? It's actually quite nice because we know exactly where something went wrong. So if this field throws an error, then we can actually exactly point to the place in the code where this went wrong, which is quite nice. Then another thing would be the topic about data loaders. This doesn't have to be in the first version of semantic conventions, but it's something that we ask, or we get asked quite often, is how well is the batching working of data loaders? Then how many operations are executed? How many operations are, one second. That's also interesting, are executing, especially for subscriptions. This is good to know. When you have an open subscription, it's actually good to know that you currently have 50 users subscribed to your API over a WebSocket or over SSE or over whatever. Then the whole client and versioning semantics is also something which is interesting, because with GraphQL, you usually, I mean, not always, but you usually have more than one client, and your clients have different versions, which is also something that's super nice to get insights on. What client version is actually used by my customers, and what does this mean for us? Then one thing which is interesting for GraphQL servers and also for the federated GraphQL approach in the end is how long does it take to validate, coerce, and maybe compile an operation? In federation, this would be how long does it take to plan the operation, and is it a cache hit or a cache miss? Then the error inside is also open. There's so much more about errors that should go in here, like when do the errors happen, what are the most common errors, and how often does this error occur, and so on. And we also covered with OpenTelemetry in Nitro a few of the schema evolution questions, because if we remove this field bar, for example, and we execute this query, the query will error out. And we in Nitro we use meters to actually track how many requests include a field and so on. So these are also questions that we want to ask. And then federation people, right? Federated GraphQL. Let's make it a bit non-specific. Distributed GraphQL could be anything. How does a query plan step perform, and how long does the planning takes to do the planning for a specific query? Now I think we can make a round, like, what else do you think should we answer in these with this specification? What's the need of a user to see? Hi, Valentine. Yeah, Brian, just shoot, just go ahead.
So yeah, I don't know the etiquette. So I probably don't. I'm not sure about the extra things that people will be wanting to see, because you know you've got a quite an extensive list here, but whatever we do needs to work nicely with the rest of the OTel specs. So for instance, can we get any of this stuff via the HTTP semantic conventions? Maybe. And the second thing I'd be wanting to know is, how does cardinality come into this? Because, for instance, field level metrics that are going to have a high cardinality, and I'm pretty sure that most APMs are not going to be able to deal with that. It's probably only a GraphQL specific APM that's not going to end up blowing up.
Yeah, so if you, and that's also a bit Benji's very right. If you start creating a trace, a span for all fields, you're doomed. That's fact. That's not necessarily a .NET problem or a Java problem. That's a problem. I would say the place which is most affected is probably JavaScript, because it's very, very fast in synchronous execution. But as soon as you use the OpenTelemetry integration there and you say that I want to trace all resolvers, you have an async resolver, which means a promise which will slow down the whole thing. At least that's what I gathered with discussions with Dotan and Camille. So that's a bit the I mean, generally async is more expensive. So the cardinality of resolvers, how we do it in the .NET world, is that we know which resolvers are async, and we only trace them by default. Meaning, when you have a field which just resolves, like you have an object, and the object has a field, a property called ID, we don't trace this one because the execution will be negligible. But when you have a field query dot whatever, then this will be interesting to trace, because I can give you an example here when we look at this. There's many more fields than just this user by ID here, right? But here is a database request on user by ID, and we have orders which has a database request. And these two fields are actually interesting to trace because these are async, right? For synchronous calls, it doesn't make sense to trace them, because that would just add so much pressure on the server itself, and also on the APM backend, because it would just generate thousands of queries spans for no reason. The field, how often is a field requested? We try to answer this question, and what we do is we have one meter, which is called graphql.field. I can't remember the name, but there's a meter which counts how many times this field was requested. And we just use the meter attributes to differentiate between which field was requested. Meaning, you have a static allocation of the meter and the counter, and you will just increment this by one as soon as a request comes in. And then you still have, like, if you have 50 fields in a request, you will have 50 counters. These counters will live as long as the server runs, and it will just increment them and then report them over metrics. That's something which seems to be acceptable in terms of memory consumption and performance, because you don't have to trace and you don't generate more. Let's put it this way: more pressure on your API doesn't mean more traces that you generate, because metrics are reported every so often over time. But it's a good question. Maybe someone has some insights about this. Like, each dimension of a meter means you have essentially a new instance of a meter, and it's something that we have to figure out what's the upper boundary there, right?
So the default limit cap in OpenTelemetry SDKs is 2000 after basically combinations of a cardinality limit. It's adjustable, but I mean, that's I wouldn't design anything that was expected to exceed that in a reasonable number of cases.
Yeah, makes sense. There's definitely most APIs definitely have more than, or bigger APIs have more than 2000.
Yeah, I think the yeah, sorry to go into the weeds on this. Is because I've come across this recently, and yeah, that so because it's the combination of field against type is the thing that will uniquely identify a field. And certainly once you get into large schemas, you can be ending up with thousands, tens of thousands. And my fear would be if somebody was to connect to Datadog or any other APM that people like, then their costs are usually based on cardinality when it comes to metrics. So, as far as I can tell from the rest of the semantic conventions, they do try and avoid the situation where cardinality exclusion is going to happen. And I think we should probably aim for the same in the GraphQL recommendations.
Yeah. I mean, there is, when we look at the I mean, I just looked at the .NET or at the HTTP metrics, right? There is, I'm not sure, but I believe that there is the path also. No, it's not in there. So that
route.
the route. Yeah, the route is in there, which will like have placeholders for IDs and whatever. But I assume that there's probably also, it's if you have a GraphQL API, it's definitely like a lot less than fields. But if you have a big REST API, you probably run into the same problems as well. Like when you have per entity, probably multiple routes that you call, right? So it's a bit, it's a good question, which direction we should take.
That's of interest. I haven't got that in front of me. Is that a recommended or optional?
The route.
Yeah.
Recommended that it is not, you don't produce it from a path that's like routes that are actually defined in your like MVC framework. So like in the Java world, it would be your Spring Boot, controller paths.
Yeah, so with the placeholders, right?
Right.
Yeah. I mean,
I wonder whether we care about all of these things, though. For example, if you were to rule out every field that returned a scalar or a list of scalars, which typically will be synchronous anyway, that's going to rule out quite a large number of those combinations. And I think generally the expensiveness is going to be actually loading object records and more so loading lists of object records, connections, things like that.
yeah, that's the problem that you run into with tracing, right? Like there, you not only have a per field trace per request, you would also have a per list item per field trace. So that's something which would be terrible for performance. I agree. Like,
Is it worth starting off with the easier stuff
oh yeah,
first?
let's do that.
Because operation name and query type, that I think they definitely belong in there, and I know they're already there.
Yeah,
I
so
would like to. There we go.
hey, go ahead. Sorry, I thought
Yeah, I think as I sort of alluded to before, I'd like to see the documents moved away from recommended to optional. Are there any other higher level ones that we feel are less controversial? I mean, you mentioned clients and version.
I think
Yeah.
a really key one is actually the hash or some other identifier of the document, because the name is obviously just arbitrary text. You can assign any name. So it's very hard to tell which version of that you're talking about. Of course, if you're using something like persisted queries or trusted documents, you could just use that identifier directly, which will be unique because it's a SHA hash or something like that. But I think that that's really, really critical. As you say, for client and stuff, some of those details will probably be available through the HTTP spans, so things like the user agent header maybe. So can they be tied together in that way rather than GraphQL having specific support for it?
Sorry, I was typing. You were talking about clients and versions?
Yeah. So if you were to indicate a client version, like GraphQL isn't specifically tied to HTTP, right? You can use it over HTTP. You can do it in various other ways as well. It is most commonly used over HTTP. And if you were to indicate the client type for that, most likely you would do it with the HTTP user agent string, which presumably is already being recorded anyway as part of your other HTTP spans.
I think you have to opt in to any particular header. Could be wrong.
User agent is captured by default. It's user underscore agent dot original now, I think, in the stable semconf. Not under HTTP dot.
Okay. Yeah, but I will fix this. We don't have to be specific, but yeah, it's a good point. What we use it for, but that can also be platform specific. We use it to identify the actual entity that you have in our client registry. And then the user agent is just not enough, because the user agent would be something like some of the by default could be the Strawberry Shake user agent or whatever, with the version of the library. Or it's your application version, which also doesn't really give insight of what query or what client version you actually use. But it's definitely usable for this, and you could correlate this information, and then you could probably find out what clients are used and in what version. Good job.
Yeah, I'm not sure that there is like a standard identifier for the version of a schema, but if we just give someone like a free text field that they can put that in, it can be like their git commit hash or whatever it is that makes sense for them to use. But I think that's really critical. Like if you see a spike in errors, you want to be able to look to see which version of the schema has that spike in errors. And is it something that's existed for a while, or is it something that's just come out of a recent deploy?
Well, the question there is that on a trace, on an API basis, right, you actually only have one version. It's not like that you would have multiple version of the same schema running at the same time. Like when you have when a request comes in, you will always hit one version of the schema, the one which is currently deployed. So the only thing that we could argue about is a specific client, like the mobile app in version 17, which has these issues, which could be done over the user agent. But currently running on the GraphQL side is very rarely more than one schema, right? Only when you do the phase from one version to the next, which should be in most cases a very short time. It could though be an attribute, although that's probably more of a resource attribute, that you would say this server is in this specific version, and that's probably also the version of the schema. I mean, it would be, thinking about it, wouldn't it be a waste to send the schema hash on every trace? Like, it's not going to change anyway until you do a deployment.
Yeah, but sometimes you can deploy a new version of of a schema without deploying the gateway. For example, in Hive, you have hot reloading of schema when it changes in the schema registry.
Yeah. Yeah, for historical analysis, this definitely is useful as well, so that you actually know that something was attached to a version. That probably would also be a schema hash. Could be the SHA hash or something like this of it.
There's
How do
also, I don't think that necessarily the hash of like the SDL, if that's what you're proposing, would be a good choice. Because you can release two different versions of the code that produce the same SDL, but they may have different backing code. So I think it shouldn't be an automated thing like that. It should be more something that actually says more about what the actual schema implementation is as well. So like the git commit hash, for example. I'd also like to comment that there are quite a few systems out there that allow, proxying of GraphQL to multiple places, and for them, they might be handling multiple schemas. I think hot reload is definitely something worth considering as well. We support it in PostGraphQL, but I generally discourage its usage in production. So I would say generally, for most users of PostGraphQL at least, you would be dealing with one schema in production. And if you change the schema, it would involve a restart of your node process. It doesn't need to, but it would generally do so.
Yeah, that's very different when you're in the gateway space, right? Because there you don't want to restart the gateway whenever there is a subgraph deployment and the schema changes. So there the hash of the schema, or at least some kind of version information, would be super helpful. And then it probably also, on the gateway level, it makes probably also sense to track the version per execution. Oh yeah, I mean the question, yeah, Valentine. The question is, what's a good ID? I mean, yeah, it's difficult.
I think perhaps it doesn't have to be that much standardized. Like we have an attribute that represents the version of the schema, but you don't have to be specific about how to represent this version. It can be a hash if you don't have any better way to differentiate between versions. And if you have a proper ID or git commit hash or something like that, you use that. And the ID can be specific to for example, the registry service you are using, like Apollo have an ID, if I will remember, when you get the SDL. So it can
Yeah,
be
I mean,
vendor specific.
yeah, I mean, we're using schema hash, so a hash of the schema. But you're right, we don't need interoperability. We don't need that to be interoperable between multiple systems. It's just an identifier. I do tend to agree, Pascal, around things like Git SHA. They feel like they belong in resources and are already handled by OTel conventions rather than it being something that we put in the GraphQL.
Now this is a good question for Trusk. We can we define resource attributes in the semantic convention as well?
Yes.
So we could technically define an optional schema ID, whatever this means. We could describe it as, it can be, for example, a SHA, but it could also be something that was configured by the user or by the agent, like the Hive integration or the Nitro integration or the Apollo server, just so that you can correlate the version of the request to the version of the deployed schema, because that probably is a correlation that's quite nice to see. When you see a request that fails, you can click on it and you pinpoint exactly which deployment broke it. So that would be nice.
Yeah, the only kind of question there is whether it is A, immutable, and B, like only one of them, which it sounded like in majority of the cases it is, but maybe there's some edge cases.
So
There,
what
yeah.
do you mean by immutable? Can it not change during the runtime of a service, or?
Today it can't, but there is work that's fairly far along called entities, which is solving a lot of the problems that resources have around immutability and organization, which those attributes you can then have descriptive identifying attributes that don't change and descriptive attributes that can change. Actually, maybe you can, I haven't been following that work super closely, but we may have options, so we should leave that on the table.
Yeah, yeah, okay, I see.
But I did want to check just that, you know, something, the existing resource attributes like service.version, you know, don't already give users enough information, right? It may not be the ideal correlation, but at least they know what version of their service they deployed and when that was updated. And maybe they have to have an internal table of here's the schema version for this service deployment
So
version.
the point there is that you will actually change the schema in federated scenarios. You will change the schema while the server executes. So even if it doesn't even matter what's in this service.version field. It could be the version of your Git version when you build your Docker container, but it could also be the version of Apollo router that you use the bundled Docker container with, and that would be the most likely the service version that runs there. And this is also immutable and will never change. While the attribute, and it sounds a bit more like it's after all it's a span attribute of the schema that could change. Like you can execute, I can deploy it once and then I can do a query and then I can do a change to the schema and then run another query, and then this version would actually be different. So if resource attributes are actually considered to be immutable for the runtime of a service, then we probably have to consider a span attribute for this one specifically.
Yeah, let's start with the span attribute, and then as the entities work fleshes out, we could possibly consider bumping that to an entity attribute.
Is it reasonable? Sorry, I'm not super familiar with this, but is it reasonable to have it as both, where the span one is effectively optional, where they're both optional, I suppose, and one can replace the other? Or does that confuse the tooling?
We don't have a great story defined as far as this hierarchy, right? Like it does feel like span attribute. We've got these multiple layers. You have span attributes, then you have instrumentation scope attributes, then you have resource attributes, and it kind of feels like you could push some things up from a compression perspective, you know, non-duplicating things. But we don't really have a good story there. So for now, I think we should pick one.
Yeah, makes sense. Makes sense.
If we're okay to move on, errors would be nice to have insight into, because obviously on the HTTP conventions, you can rely on HTTP status, but not in GraphQL. It all looks like 200s to me.
That will probably most likely go into the events part, right? Of a span, that you actually have an error event. And I know that it's a bit there is the convention around errors in which is generic. I can't remember. Is it now exception dot stack trace and so on? So these ones are actually the ones which are already supported by a lot of the open telemetry backends. I mean, the graphical execution doesn't have a stack trace per se, but it would probably be nice if we could reuse them as well for graphical specific errors, because then you would actually get the tooling to work without any issue.
There's also error.type and error.message, which might be more appropriate if you don't have exceptions.
Again, don't really know so much about this stuff. In GraphQL, you can yield many errors from the same response, and most likely what we would do is do that at the end rather than as they occur, just because it's more efficient and GraphQL collects them together anyway. So in that case, what would you do there? Would you just create multiple error spans, and then use those properties?
Yeah, I mean, trust. You're probably more experienced to answer this one, but
I guess your options so you don't have stack traces, right? These aren't exceptions that you want to record with stack traces. These are just like kind of named errors that contain all the information you want to report about them.
They don't have stack traces, but they do have paths, and the path tells you where in the GraphQL operation the error occurred.
So on the span itself, there's error type, which you would want to put something in there. And error message, depends on how structured you want to make them. We also are right now working through extending span attributes to support complex attributes, which means you would be able to do something, yeah, exactly like Benji you put into chat here, where you could have an attribute on the span. It would be, a GraphQL specific error attribute, which could then be a map of, a list of maps or whatever.
would we, like, is there any prior art because these errors are reported as events, right? On a span.
So you're hitting all the
that there is a span for the error. It's actually there exists a span and you report an error on the span, right?
Yeah, so span events are being transitioned to log-based events in OpenTelemetry. But yes, you could definitely record each of these errors individually as an event.
What do you mean by transition to log-based events? So are the events on the spans, are they going to disappear, or
they're going to be deprecated?
Mhm.
And events in OpenTelemetry will just mean over the log signal, log-based events.
Right.
There will be a transition behind the scenes options to still emit those over your OTLP proto as span events for backward compatibility. But going forward, events will mean log-based events. But your point stands. You could definitely record one of those for each.
So that would be more of a correlation thing, though. I guess. So it's like some spans would have, the span ID would then tie up with the attributes on the log events. So it's not intrinsic to the span that it's an error, because the logs are just somewhere else. So
Yeah, so you would still, on the span, you would still stick, error type,
yeah,
error
we need
message.
to have an attribute, some sort of attribute on the span to say this was a GraphQL error.
Right. Well, I guess on spans, you have the span status already, and you have the span status can have a message. So there's multiple different options. Maybe I can take this as an action item to actually write up the different options that I think you have for this. We can follow up.
Great. Yeah, that would be great, because that's, I mean, I'm not proud of it, but one way of how we reported spans in the very beginning, which is still in, is this. So we at least know how many spans, how many errors there were in this operation or in this resolver. And if there are errors, in the past they were reported as something completely different here. So good to know that we cannot rely on events in the future. But it's also good to know that we'll have more complex properties.
And you can events, just that it won't be span events anymore. It will be events.
Its very own thing, you mean?
Yeah. So they go over the log signal, over at least at the OTLP and over the log API, but we are calling those events. There's an event name field now on logs, and if the log record has an event name, that makes it an event in OpenTelemetry terminology.
Makes sense.
And the difference between that and regular logs is events. That event name needs to imply a specific schema of basically the event attributes. So in semantic conventions, we're defining events for multiple semantic conventions, and that's what that means.
Okay.
On the topic of errors, there's, I think, two things that we care about in GraphQL errors. One is like the schema coordinate at which it occurred. So like the type name and the field name that uniquely identifies effectively what resolver through that error. But there is also the operation path, because it might be that field only threw an error because of bad data that was returned by one of its parent resolvers. So I think we should trace both the path and the type and field name. Which I think also we should standardize on just doing that as a schema coordinate, since schema coordinates are becoming specified now.
Yeah, so on this note, we have a few span attributes that we already report, which are also a bit redundant. So technically, the coordinate is enough. We also record the declaring type and the field name, but you see, it's essentially the coordinate combines both of them. Then what we report, which is questionable if a field is deprecated, definitely the name is completely wrong. And additionally to the path, what we also report is hierarchy.
Yeah, so the hierarchy that you've got there is like a weakened form of an operation path, where an operation path will also indicate things like the concrete polymorphic type, if that was necessary. So if you had polymorphism, the actual concrete runtime type. But yeah, broadly similar amidst the list indices. I think one of the key questions that we have here and need to apply is what do we actually need to record in these spans and what can we correlate later? So for example, if we know specifically which document produced this, then we don't need to necessarily count the individual field calls because the document knows which fields it contains. Obviously, that won't then tie in with the natural processing, but it will be a lot more efficient to just say what the document was and then do the counting somewhere else. So I do wonder what could be done in those paths as well.
Yeah.
Sorry to interrupt. I'm gonna need to drop. What's the kind of follow-up?
Oh yeah. Good question. We're on time. Sorry, I didn't watch the time. So it's a bit up to us what we want to do. The main graphical work group meets monthly. And we will just create a new agenda for next time. Then everyone can add their topics, like the agenda that we have now. This is free for everyone to add stuff to it. So we'll create a new entry there, and then we can just add ourselves to the next agenda. The only question that we have to ask ourselves is how often do we want to meet, and in what iterations? The main graphical work group meets monthly, but we also have working groups which meet weekly. So it's a bit up to us how to decide. What's general feeling? Weekly, bi-weekly, monthly?
I think what I would propose is that we take a lot of the things we discussed today and try and write up and research them asynchronously and then recap again next month. And if it then turns out that we're going to need a lot of heavy synchronous meetings, then we can arrange that. But for now, I would just stick with monthly.
Sounds good to me.
Cool. So should we just open and follow issues in that OTel WG repo?
That would be perfect. Yes.
Awesome.
That would be
Awesome.
perfect. Cool. Great first meeting. And then let's take some time to think and have a look at the repository if there's any issues that pop up where or discussions where we can comment on, and then see you all in a month.
Thanks.
Thanks a lot.
Bye.
See you.